Hey everyone, Mr. David here with part two of our winter Christmas break series, and we're on the Civil War. We did part one last time, all about kind of the continuing causes of the U.S. Civil War into the 1850s. Today, we're actually going to move ourselves into the specific fighting, and we'll start kind of right at the beginning, and then we'll move ourselves into about the first 2 years into and through 1862. Remember that the AP exam will not necessarily ask about specific battles per se, but at the same time, they can certainly ask about advantages both sides had going into the war, and they can look at other things that happened aside from kind of specific military history. And as the Civil War is basically the biggest war in American history, there's a lot of things that can be said, and there's a lot of things that happen in that regard. So we'll see that as we come through. So I'll take you to kind of the start of the war, move you through the advantages both sides had, and then kind of prepping us up for war. And then I'll tell you about kind of the overall movement in the first couple years. So if you remember from the last video, we talked about the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, is elected, and there's this big exodus that occurs of 7 of the 15 slave states. And their secession does not necessarily trigger the Civil War right then. Again, 7 of 15, it's not exactly the numbers that you need. You're going to need a few more of the slave states to join your side. But, obviously the conflict is getting very, very close, especially because attempts at compromise have not worked themselves out. However, the official kind of trigger into the war will occur in April 1861, and it happens at a fort known as Fort Sumter. So let me kind of explain what's gone on since the South has seceded. So in late 1860, early 1861, those 7 southern states have officially seceded and have declared themselves to be the Confederacy of the United States of America. And during that time, these states decided to take over military forts that were in the South, even though technically these forts were a part of the government. But this is kind of the idea here. Hey, we're seceding. We see ourselves as being apart from this. So obviously that includes any military forts and all that kind of stuff. So by April 1861, there are only 2 in those 7 states that have not been taken over, and one is known as Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter is in South Carolina, and it's being held on to by some Union troops, but barely. And the reality is it's not going to last much longer. They're running out of supplies. It's not going to work itself out too well. So there was kind of this idea that, okay, let's just let it run out of supplies, and then, that will just kind of be the end of it, and it will fall to the South. However, Lincoln makes a calculated decision, and what he decides is to try to restock the fort, thereby kind of allowing it to continue to defend itself, or, at least have these Union troops defend it there and not go under Southern control. This is kind of an example of something that by itself isn't really that big of a deal. If Fort Sumter goes to the Confederacy, it's kind of like, who cares, but as the South has already seceded, it's almost like it doesn't necessarily matter. However, what Lincoln is trying to do is to get the South to act first. He doesn't necessarily want to commit to war right now, and certainly if he does, most in the North were, kind of on this idea that the North should be patient and the North should just kind of wait for these Confederate states to go back. So what he wants to basically do is get the South to fire the first shots. And if the South fires the first shots, then he's going to have more support, and he's going to say, hey, look, we were just trying to restock this, and that's the way it goes. And by the way, if the South decides to let it restock itself, then maybe there is the possibility for reconciliation and for bringing things together and things like that. Again, that's at least a possibility. Well, and by the way, Lincoln does inform the Confederacy of his plans in order to make this occur. Well, sure enough, as probably could be guessed, as the reinforcements come, the South fires upon them, thus making this rescue mission fail, and shortly thereafter, Fort Sumter will fall. Some consider this to be kind of the first battle of the Civil War. I do not. Instead, I think of this as kind of the final cause and kind of that final trigger that shows that there will be no compromise and that war is now officially the course of action at this point. Lincoln originally calls for only 75,000 troops. And I make that comment because that is a very, very low number, especially considering how long this will go and how many troops will actually be needed at the end of the day. However, it is also representative of the fact that in April 1861, as war is going on, neither side really think this is going to be a long war, and they think this is going to be kind of quick. Actually, Lincoln going to the point of saying, hey, we're going to bring these states back from their rebellion, not even kind of acknowledging the deeper effect of this. But we're going to see just how quick in the conflict this escalates into what's going to be a long situation. As a result of what happens at Fort Sumter, 4 other southern states will secede. This is what we refer to as the second wave of Southern secession. These are states that are obviously slave states, but they are not really in the deep South. They include Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, as well as Virginia, by the way, which had kind of held off, and now they're going to be kind of the big southern state as far as population, location, all the rest of those kind of things. For the 4 remaining slave states, we refer to them as the border states because they are kind of the border between the real South and the real North, will not secede at this time. They include Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. Okay, the question, though, is that in April 1861, how long would they not secede? Or would they secede at some point? Again, hard to know at this time, but either way, 11 states seceding is enough to make this doable, and we are now officially at war. So Sumter is kind of that last cause. And again, some would argue that war was maybe inevitable before Sumter, but technically that was not really the case. There still seemed to be some, at least sort of hope, but it's become pretty clear at this time that is not going to be what's going on. Here we see the shots launching upon Fort Sumter. And then again, here's a map of Confederate secession. I've shown you this before, but something to kind of keep in mind, remember, is those first 7 states, they're in the Deep South. They are the most entrenched with slavery and, most committed to it. And then we see here the 4 other Confederate states that will leave in a second wave of secession. And then in the green, we have what are referred to as the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. And again, the question is going to be kind of like, are they going to secede or are they not? Spoiler, they will never actually end up seceding, but we'll talk about why that is the case in just a couple minutes. So now what we're going to do is go through the strengths and the weaknesses of both sides. And again, these are strengths and weaknesses coming into the war in 1861. Most of them will be strengths and weaknesses, kind of like continuing the entirety, but some things will change, and there are some things that are strengths that are more perceived than actually being real, so we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But both sides are going to have kind of a variety of different strengths and weaknesses, and it's one of the reasons why this war will last 4 years, a lot longer than really either side thought when war first breaks out. probably one of the biggest strengths, if not the biggest strengths that the North will have, is their massive population in comparison to the South. About 22 million people lived in the northern part of the United States, or at least what would be considered the Union. Only 9 million in the South, and that included about 3.5 million slaves. So the difference in population between the two sides is going to be pretty big. Remember, if you have a bigger population, it means you have more soldiers that can fight. You have more people that are able to resume work back home. And so all of that would be significant to consider and look at there. Another big thing that you want to keep in mind here is, at least at the beginning, you do have these 4 slave states that have remained loyal to you. Again, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. If these states would go to the Confederacy, their population would increase, and also their industrial capacity would increase quite substantially. So the fact that, at least at the beginning, these states are not going to be a part of the Confederacy and they are going to stick with the Union is going to be extremely important and significant for the progress of the Union and kind of taking away from the power of the Confederacy. Big pool of military experience in the North. West Point, which is the Army Military Academy, most graduates were from the North. So that means you have a bigger pool of experience and stuff like that. So that's important to consider. North will also have a stronger naval capacity than the South, and so that's big. And then another thing that you want to be really kind of considering is that the North has the factories. Okay, they have the industrial output versus the South, which really does not. And again, you're fighting a war. So what that means is that, again, you're going to need supplies and you're going to need materials and you're going to need, armor and guns and all the rest of those things. Again, because they have the factories and the industrial capacity in place, they're going to be able to have an easier time equipping their soldiers and those type of things, which will be helpful as well. In addition, they have more food. Again, when we think of agriculture, we obviously think of the South, but really what the South has is cotton. In the North, there are more horses, more cows, more sheep, more wheat, more oats. Again, these are the staple kind of foods that you're going to need to keep your soldiers fed so they can fight for you and do all the things that they need to do. Finally, another thing that I want to kind of mention here that is significant is that not everyone in the South is going to be as gung-ho on secession and the Confederacy as really kind of the hardcore secessionists. And so because of that, there really isn't that total loyalty from all the population. And the best kind of example of that is that a portion of Virginia, in the western part, will be so opposed to the Confederacy that they will actually break off into their own separate state in 1861, 1862. Well, again, that's going to be significant. And again, that's one example, but that's showing of some in the kind of general South that will have these same kind of ideas and viewpoints and whatever else. This is sort of obvious, but it just is worthy of mentioning here. The North and the Union is an established country. Okay, they have a treasury. Okay, they have currency. They have a system of government that's been in place now. Obviously, it's been disrupted because 11 states have left, but still, because they're an established country, they're able to draw on those type of things. Versus the South, and we'll get to them in just a sec, are starting from scratch. So it's not going to be as necessarily as easy. We refer to it as the North or the Union, and again, we should probably refer to it a little bit more as the Union, because if we look at this map specifically, obviously the North is, clearly what this is, but also a part of this is California and Nevada and Oregon, so that's what you see in the blue as well. They won't play too much of a role in this, but that they are still technically loyal, and so that's significant to look at there. That one state that you see there, that's Kansas. Okay, Kansas will become, I mentioned this in the other one, Kansas does become officially a free state in 1861, so they're technically a part of this as well. And then we see in the red our Confederate States of America, the CSA, and then in the light blue, those four border states whose loyalty will be somewhat, we'll be paying attention to and looking at as we continue on. Okay, just some things that you can see here. Look at the difference in population, railroad, manufacturing, and workers between the North and the South. So much and clearly of the North. It is very, very um, obviously advantageous that they have a bigger population to pull from, more railroad to transport things, obviously manufacturing, and then workers, which is so critical because with so many people that are going to be fighting, you're going to need your workers to be able to take care of the factories and output back at home. And then here we have our advantages. Again, corn, wheat, livestock, horse, mules, acres, population, soldiers, men to draw upon, gross national product, and railroad. Again, all of these pretty significant advantages, and in some like extremely high towards the Union versus the South. Okay, so let's talk more specifically about what we refer to as the border states. These four states that make up that are slave states, but will make up the Union. The big trick for the Union is maintaining their loyalty, and so again, you just don't quite know how that's going to happen or if it's going to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all four and kind of explain their situations so you're able to understand a little bit better, if there was a prospect of them leaving or if they were pretty safe. The safest one by far for the Union is Delaware. Delaware was not going to secede, although slave state, very small percentage of its population were slaves, and its economic ties were definitely with the North. So that was not very much a concern for the Union, so not really a big problem there. Maryland is going to be a little more tricky, but one thing that Abraham Lincoln does, which is pretty controversial, or will be, I guess, is going to be that when some Union soldiers are killed by pro-Confederate townspeople in Maryland, Lincoln will send in troops and suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the constitutional right you have to know why you are being arrested. And he will suspend, and that's supposed to be what gets you like a speedy trial and all those type of things. He will suspend that right, largely, to be honest, to keep Maryland loyal to the Union and kind of put down the Confederate, I don't know, burst or whatever you want to say in the state. To be honest, again, controversial. It's kind of that question of, constitutionality. I mean, it's definitely disrupting constitutionality, but seen as a necessity by Lincoln for maintaining the loyalty of Maryland. Kentucky was very deeply divided. They did have a governor that was more supportive of the Confederacy, but then they had a legislative that was kind of opposed to secession. So what they kind of wanted was for both sides to kind of respect their neutrality and kind of leave them alone. Lincoln will do a really nice job of not pressuring Kentucky, just kind of keeping an eye on them, but make sure everything's okay, but not feeling like they needed to actually fight on the Union side. And that strategy will be effective. Kentucky will not secede anytime either. Missouri is another tough one. Again, some good pockets of Confederate support in there. However, still strong enough Union support where they're going to be able to keep enough control of the state to keep things involved. Lincoln's strategy towards the border states is to not interfere. Okay, again, just kind of respect the neutrality, leave them alone, and kind of continue on with life. This strategy will be very good, especially in the case of like a Kentucky or Missouri, where they don't feel pressured. They feel, like it's a fair deal. And now what that lends itself to is all four of these states not seceding. And again, they don't really play like a huge pivotal role in the war by any means, but even them not seceding and becoming a part of the Confederacy is a big enough victory and a big enough advantage for the Union. Okay, let's talk about the Confederate advantages. And it would seem like a lot of things stacked in favor of the Union and stacked against the Confederacy. But by many stretches, that's true. But there are some things that we do want to consider here that maybe the Union kind of neglected or just didn't think were as significant as they really were. First off, obviously, the South has some odds stacked against them, especially in regards to men and in regards to manufacturing and industry or whatever else. And although they felt they were the underdog, they did feel like they could win. Kind of that David and Goliath story, obviously biblical roots, but the South is going to kind of look at their situation and equate it very much to some instances in American history. So, for example, like the American Revolution, okay, the colonists taking on the mightiest country in the world, and mightiest empire really at that point, Britain, and winning. Okay, they're going to look to the Texas Revolution. Say, hey, look at these random, kind of patriots from Texas. They fought against the mighty Mexican government. Not probably as relevant because the Mexican government was not very strong. But either way, they're going to say, hey, look, we're the clear underdogs, but that doesn't matter. We can win this, just like in our years past, we were able to win this as well. So they definitely feel that motivation there. A big advantage for the Confederacy is the fact that they do have a huge land area. Okay, 750,000 square miles. Okay, there's also a lot of mountains, a lot of rivers, a lot of other terrain that's going to make capturing this and conquering this land really, really challenging for the Union. Okay, in addition, kind of to that, is that the Confederacy only need to play defense. Okay, the Union has to attack in order to bring the Confederacy back. The Confederacy just needs to sit around, be able to defend long enough to where finally kind of the Union or Lincoln's going to come in and say, hey, look, let's make a deal or let's bring you back and let's figure this out. Okay, that's really the only way this is going to work. And so, again, that's a huge advantage if you only have to play defense. You're able to buy yourself some time. Again, a lot of rivers down in the South. The main area of fighting, which is going to be in kind of the northern Virginia, D.C. area. There are rivers all around there that kind of provide a natural defense. There's also, again, the Mississippi. And again, taking control of the Mississippi is going to be challenging for the Union. So these things help provide some natural defenses that make it hard to really penetrate the South as much as the Union would probably like. They don't necessarily have as many people as the North, but they do have slaves. And so the idea here is in 1861 that while the young men or even mid-age men go and fight in the war, slaves will still be around in order to work and maintain business on the farms and stuff like that. So that was seen as something that was good and advantageous for the Confederate war effort. Similar to not having to play offense, Confederacy technically does not really need to win. Okay, again, all they need to do is kind of hold out and put enough pressure on the Union to where the Union finally will say, hey, look, let's bring you back. What can we do for, putting this in acceptable terms and stuff like that? Versus the Union needs a full out, victory. So again, that's obviously a bigger advantage for the South. The South really felt like God was on their side, and when things initially start, the morale from the soldiers, but especially the Southern people, is very, very strong, as they do feel like they're on the right side of things. And again, they feel like God's on their side and all the rest of this kind of stuff, and they think that's going to take them to the level that they need to be at. Generals in the South seem to be a little bit stronger than that in the North. Again, West Point, obviously I just mentioned as being a Northern institution, very true. But there were other military academies and military schools that were in the South that were not West Point. So more of those than in the North, which again had the storied one, West Point, but not really a whole lot else. So there was definitely some good generals. And also kind of a real passion, I would say, for military service down in the South and things like that. In 1861, the Confederacy feels like they might be able to get the border states. And again, definitely some pretty big pockets of Confederacy in there. Not really in Delaware, but definitely in Kentucky and Missouri, and at least to some degree Maryland. So they felt that they could support their efforts. And they also thought that maybe at one point they would decide to secede and join with the South. So that's still there on their, prospect. And then one of the biggest things that gives the South an advantage is cotton. And there's a few reasons why. One would be obviously the big prospect of, or not prospect, the big um, economic, incentives and benefits. Again, the Confederacy is going to be able to sell cotton, so they can afford supplies and all the rest of those type of things, which is really, really good. But the South believed that their cotton was so important and so significant that the British and or the French would involve themselves in the war in order to make sure Southern cotton was protected. And that's a really interesting point here, and it's something that deserves attention because just kind of a reminder, when the United States won the American Revolution, the colonists and the odds were very much stacked against their favor. One of the primary reasons why they were able to win was because the French intervened and were able to help out. So in a similar way, now what the Confederacy is kind of looking at is they're going to say, hey, look, our numbers don't necessarily match up. We're outnumbered, we're out industrialized, we're out manufactured, whatever else. But if a foreign country, at least one of them, but maybe even both, Britain and France come in and join us, we will be able to take the Union. And so that prospect of foreign intervention is certainly on their mind in 1861. And this graphic, by the way, is similar to the other ones I've shown you. But the big thing that I do want to kind of note is that cotton, obviously, is going to be massive Confederate advantage. But you'll see here by the later part of the war, things will decrease. Okay, so let me just make a couple comments about into the war, and then we'll talk about the two governments, and then kind of our first few battles and our first couple of years of wartime. Both sides lacking from preparation, and really no side was prepared for war in 1861. So, just kind of an FYI. One of the reasons why this war will drag on because of the fact that neither were prepared for a long war. So then once they actually come to prepare and whatever else, take some time there in that regard. Military leadership, relatively old, especially for the Union. The Union's major commander is going to be Winfield Scott, who definitely was a good commander, no doubt about it, in the Mexican-American War. But at this point, by 1861, he's old. He suffers from many health problems. He has a vertigo. He's pretty outdated. With that being said, Winfield Scott calls for a plan that he thinks will help the Union beat the South, which is known as the Anaconda Plan. And just like an anaconda snake strangles its enemies or whatever else and kills them, the idea here was from Winfield Scott. You would surround the South slowly and then kind of suffocate it and finally block it up. We'll talk about this in a little bit later, but the Anaconda Plan never really comes into full effect because Winfield Scott said it was going to take over 2 years to really take over the South. And Lincoln at the time said, nah, that's too long. It's not going to take that long to win. Well, again, it actually will take 4 years. So maybe if they did actually fully implement the Anaconda Plan at the very beginning, things might have gone in another direction. But again, we will stray away from alternative history. Both sides figure out fast that they need to raise troops quickly. So how exactly do you do that? Well, the easiest way is to conscript. Literally, basically force people to serve. And that number of those serving and the number of people drafted and things like that will increase as time goes on. By the way, that will especially be the case for the South. Towards the end of the war, the South has run out of men that they are allowing the conscription, or they are having conscription of men up to 65 years old. Again, I don't think anyone 65 years old is probably fit to really be fighting in a war, but that's what kind of takes place as the war continues on, especially in the South, with a smaller pool to draw from. In case you're interested in military history, we have a new major type of weapon, the rifle musket, which should be fired quickly by 1861 standards, 3 shots a minute and up to 600 yards. Again, just kind of an FYI, new technology. One of the big things that's going to happen throughout the wartime is a lack of pursuit. And what we mean by this is that if you're fighting somebody and you defeat them, you shouldn't let them be able to run away. Because if they run away, they regroup, they get things back to where they need to go, and then they're ready to recharge and stuff like that. So this is kind of the idea. You get them when they're down. Both sides, but especially early on in the North, that will be a struggle as there is a lack of pursuit. And again, this is one of the reasons why big victories will not be able to be capitalized on, which is obviously problematic. But another thing that I want to mention here is that the North will blockade the South. It's not a perfect blockade because of the sheer number of territory, but again, it's better than nothing. And it will get kind of stronger over time. There is some naval warfare that occurs in the Civil War. Not a whole lot, but so, the Confederacy will build up some ironclad ships that will try to sink and go after Union blockade, some stuff, but really for the most part, this is a war that takes place on the ground. Especially early on, there's going to be a lot of these kind of romantic viewpoints of the war. Hey, this is so nice. Well, this is going to be about honor and bravery and greatness, and, this is going to be some real big stuff going on. And the reality is that's just not the case, and this war will not be very pretty by any stretch. Both sides will kind of be constantly on the move. Most people die from disease because of crude medical practices than really some great battle or something like that. But nonetheless, it shows us that the realities of war typically do not match up with early, kind of ideas of the way war might go. And I'll return to this a little bit, but this is the idea behind the Anaconda Plan. Like I said, it never comes in because Winfield Scott said it was going to take 2 years to really fully execute, and Lincoln said, no, that's too much time. We're going to get this thing taken care of in a few months. Again, though, 2 years was not enough to end the Civil War. It will take 4. I now want to spend just a couple minutes talking about the war effort on both sides that's going to be launched by the Confederate government and the Union government. I'll use kind of the same general categories and then dive into kind of some more specifics and things like that. So what the Confederacy is basically going to set up is kind of like a mimic U.S. government set down in the South. And their president is this man here whose name is Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis has sometimes been described as weak and issues with micromanagement and other things like that. And obviously, he will be on the losing side of this. However, some have noted his positives, in particular the fact that as the Confederacy launches into this new government and this new war, he did have military experience, he did have government experience, and so that, would help him out in this regard. Jefferson Davis's probably biggest accomplishment will be appointing Robert E. Lee as the major Confederate general, and I put 3 kind of asterisks there just as a kind of a, wow, this is the person that is really going to be responsible for a very valiant effort put together by the Confederate Army. And again, there's really no question, especially at the beginning, that the clear advantage is going to be to the South. And again, getting Davis getting Robert E. Lee to be that general is going to be so significant. Again, like I said, they set up kind of like a mimic U.S. government. So there's going to be a cabinet with the Secretary of State, Secretary of War, all that kind of stuff. And his cabinet will have major turnover, as a lot of the appointments will end up resigning and other things like that. Him and his cabinet were known for deliberations and meetings that went on for huge amounts of times. Again, Davis sometimes seen as kind of this micromanager that led to problems. So anyways, that's usually not a good sign when you have just extreme turnover happening at a pretty regular occurrence. There will be a technically Confederate Congress with a House of Representatives and a Senate. There's no real political parties in the Confederacy, so it's just kind of like a yes man's world. And again, really the only thing the government prioritizes is war, fighting war, and all things associated with that. With that being said, though, there is kind of a big thing that you need to do if you fight a war, which is you need to figure out how to finance it and how to get the money for it. And so Davis and his new government kind of try to figure out what to do. Well, remember, because they are a new country, or whatever you want to call them, a new entity, whatever else, the point of the story is that they do not have, a treasury or a currency to go from really here. So, of course, what they're going to do is something that we know does not work, which is just to print huge amounts of money. This will result in massive inflation, and by the war's end, Confederate currency will be basically worth nothing because of this extreme hyperinflation. However, at the beginning, things are okay, but it turns pretty sour, especially, a year, 2, 3 in. Another criticism of Jefferson Davis and the Confederate war effort as a whole would be the fact that they never really utilized slaves to fight. They do utilize slaves to some extent to continue, working at home and other things like that. But when they get down to the end and there's not many men left, they really just don't want slaves to take part in this. And again, that was probably a blown opportunity, because at least they would have provided some numbers, but either way, doesn't ever occur. The other thing, just Confederate war effort as a whole, is that morale is super high at the beginning, but morale will move and decrease pretty quickly. Okay, so here's a look, by the way, at Confederate inflation. And you see here at the beginning, okay, January 1861, okay. And then all of a sudden, look at those huge spikes. And again, these spikes, by the way, happening in 1862, 1863, this is still pretty humongous. But the reality is it just doesn't look very big because of where it goes in 1864. And even it looks like there's this tremendous dip. I mean, yeah, to some extent. But at the same time, look at that, it's still 50%. And then look how high it shoots up at the very end of this once the Confederacy is no longer. So again, this is really problematic. But this is what happens when you're just printing currency that has no value. Here, by the way, is a look at a Confederate bill. This is a $500 Confederate bill. And again, they try to basically replace the dollars with these down in the South. And then here's a look so you can see this, prices and inflation. Again, something like wood going for $10 now by 1865, $300. Okay, so you can see just how drastic this inflation will become. Okay, when we talk about the Union, it's not to say the Union doesn't have its problems, but because the Union is an established country, it will help out when you're talking about raising money and, funding and all that kind of stuff. The Union war effort centers around Abraham Lincoln. At the beginning, though, there's a lot of uncertainty around Lincoln, primarily because Lincoln has little political experience and really did not have any military experience. However, as the war continues on, Lincoln will actually dedicate himself to learning about the military, and he will spend basically the entire summer of 1861 studying war and studying strategy and studying military things So although he was not by any stretch really experienced in it, by doing that kind of stuff, he gained knowledge and was able to be, again, a very much a very, very good and effective president during wartime. He has a cabinet, as opposed to Jefferson Davis, his cabinet is very stable, and most will remain in their post the entire time. One of the kind of strengths given to Lincoln, and again, it's the exact opposite of Davis, is that he kind of let his cabinet do what they needed to do, and he kept tabs on them, but he didn't micromanage them, so that made them feel better. That made them perform well. His biggest person would be Secretary of State Seward, who, if you recall, was going to be the Republican candidate, if not for kind of the enemies he had acquired. So it makes sense that he's kind of the leading man on Lincoln's cabinet. Again, the government will continue and the Congress will continue, except it's obviously missing all the southern states that have left. However, even though it's dominated by Republicans, there is a specific group of Republicans that kind of serve a little bit as opposition. And this group is the Radical Republicans. This is a relatively small group within the Congress. We talk about them more when we get to Reconstruction. They are vocal, though. And their big thing was that they believed that Lincoln needed to do more for slaves, need to do more for blacks, and needed to kind of go after the Confederacy more. So they will be pretty critical of kind of what they will perceive as Lincoln's inability to do just more about slavery and blacks and all that kind of stuff. Again, they have to finance the war. Again, they're at an advantage compared to the Confederacy in the sense that they do have a treasury, they do have gold reserves, they do have revenue coming in from some tariffs, but it's still just not quite enough. Again, war is so expensive. So there will be some new taxes that introduce, but the big one that is introduced for the first time is a income tax. And so this will just apply to certain people that make a relatively high annual income. It's not an extremely big income tax. It's a percentage. But that is obviously going to be the norm. And today, that's a huge tax as people's income tax. But anyways, it's something to kind of keep in mind as, again, this is what's necessary to finance war, 1861. Another thing that really is good for the Union war effort is they do have, again, manufacturing, they do have industry, but it will grow quite substantially during the U.S. Civil War. So much so, by the way, that a lot of what we call the Second Industrial Revolution, a lot of it is attributable to what happens in this, as the Union prepares and gets ready to go and all those type of things. Another thing, though, that I'll kind of mention is there will be it's not all peaches and cream, if we're talking about the Union war effort. We're talking about, people being angry, especially poor Irish immigrants who are going to be really serving in pretty high numbers for the Union Army. There are some draft riots that occur, the most notable being in 1863 in New York, where Irish workers will attack the recruiting station. Then they went on to kill blacks in the North, who they blamed for the war. Many dead, many burned, much damage going on. Again, kind of just crazy times. And it's just kind of a mess. But overall, the Union war effort will be relatively strong in what they set up. Here, by the way, is a look at these draft riots in New York in 1863. Okay, so I want to make a couple comments going into war, and then I'll talk just for a little bit about the first couple major battles. Again, Robert E. Lee is going to be that big military general for the Confederacy that is going to be so important for early Confederate success. And so, again, we'll talk about him more as we go through, but he will be instrumental. As we enter into war, it's important to realize there's war going on in a few places. There's war going on in the West, near like the Mississippi. There's some war going on kind of deeper into the South. But the main area, the main theater of war is going on in Northern Virginia. And this is where basically what we're going to be seeing is Northern attacks into the South into the northern parts of Virginia and things like that. So, when we talk about a lot of our major battles that are occurring, that's where it is. And that's also where like the best generals will be. So it'll be Robert E. Lee. And then later on, we'll kind of talk about how things change. But and even early on, though, the Union's putting their best generals forward in that regard. The Union generals will take time to develop, and the reality is that will be a huge problem early on. However, things will figure itself out by 1863. And the people that end up becoming the major Union generals are Ulysses S. Grant and Tecumseh Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, and we'll talk more about them both. But especially Grant will be kind of like this just the unlikely hero, basically. All right. He was essentially an alcoholic farmer, a vet of wartime, pretty average, military general, whatever else. And then all of a sudden, once he gets his opportunity, he will really, really do some big stuff. But again, that occurs later on. Again, this Anaconda plan that Winfield Scott puts together will not really go into play, but then as war continues on, it will sort of come into play through the blockade. Again, this blockade at the beginning takes time to really develop over the South, but as time progresses, the blockade will be instrumental in the success of the Union. Also, just a reminder, the Union has a man advantage. They outnumber the Confederacy by a huge degree. At the beginning of the war, the Union doesn't really utilize this advantage. But as war continues on, using this advantage of soldiers will be so important for the success of Union troops. And again, Robert E. Lee here. And just another look, again, this Anaconda plan, this idea of squeezing out the South, surrounding them and stuff like that. Again, it's not really going to work. Well, it's not really going to come into play because, again, Lincoln was opposed to it due to the time constraints. But, again, he should have kind of thought about that a little bit. And, again, here's some of our looks here, and this is what we consider to be the Western theater. So this will be largely a lot over control of the Mississippi. And so, again, we don't really necessarily need to know any of the battles too much, but it's important to kind of know the pace and the way things go for the war. Okay, so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the first, few battles. If you study the Civil War, you'll notice that every battle has two names given to it. And this shouldn't necessarily be a surprise, but the reason why is because there's a name that has been given to it by the Union and a name that's been given it to the Confederacy. I usually stick with the Union names. So the first major battle that takes place is what is known as First Bull Run or First Manassas. And again, this is like the bit, it's like, okay, we're going to have war now. Well, kind of surprisingly to the Union, the South wins. Oh, shoot. That wasn't necessarily supposed to happen. Okay. Wow. Geez. Okay. Well, all right. Maybe, things not really going so well. Yeah, they're not. So there's going to be a new Union general that comes into play. His name is George McClellan. George McClellan will end up being extremely controversial for a variety of reasons. But one of the things is that he did not get along well with President Lincoln. However, he was seen as basically being the person that was going to take things over. McClellan was also seen as somebody that was extremely arrogant about his abilities, but also extremely cautious. And again, because of this, he will not capitalize on gains made when the Union does start winning. But we'll get to that in a little bit later on. And again, he will not use the great man advantage that the Union has to their advantage. So this also presents with itself a problem. Shortly after First Bull Run, there's some fighting going on in the West, and we have our first kind of major battle. And once again, kind of surprisingly to some, the Confederates will also win over in the West initially. Okay. At this point, it's pretty clear. This is not going to be some easy victory or something like that. This is going to prolong itself a little bit more. At this point, Lincoln is calling for more troops and, recruiting more guys and conscripting, etc. It will not be until January 1862 that the Union will have their first real victory. And again, even this victory that they do have is not going to be extremely huge by any stretch. It's just kind of a legitimate victory that they're finally able to claim. So early on, this is going in the Confederacy's favor. Here, by the way, is a look at Bull Run. Okay, so let's talk about a couple other things going on with the fighting. Okay, McClellan's problems will grow, especially as he does not work well with Lincoln. He does not work well with fellow leaders, military leaders, and stuff like that. Just not really a great commander by any stretch. Things also demonstrate themselves as being particularly bad in the Peninsula Campaign. Again, this is what you see here in this picture, kind of this Northern Virginia area and stuff like that, where McClellan was ordered to attack. And what happens here is his soldiers, which numbered 121,000, will meet a group of soldiers that had 11,000 only for Confederates. This would be the time to strike. Get them. You outnumber them over 10-1. Show them who's boss and make a stand and, capitalize on your victory. Things don't go that way even close. And again, McClellan is largely to blame. McClellan believes that the Confederates have more soldiers than they do. And actually that they are rivaling the number of soldiers as the Union Army. Again, as you can tell from these numbers, they're not even close. In fairness, give some credit to the Confederate generals who had their soldiers run around in circles in order to make it seem like there were more. But either way, McClellan needed to be aggressive at this moment. They were only about 70 miles from Richmond, the Confederate capital, but he does not. And instead, he will wait and he will order reinforcements before he attacks. Well, this is problematic for a few reasons. It's during this time that the South is able to get more troops, so now you're not able to really capitalize like you would have before. And then the other thing is that those reinforcements from the Union never come. And that primarily has to do with the work of a Confederate general by the name of Stonewall Jackson. As you might guess, that's why he gets that name, because he blocked, or him and his crew, blocked reinforcements from being able to come down. Kind of like this inspiring tale for the South. And wow, this is a blown opportunity. With that being said, we're in, kind of the early parts of 1862 at this point, and the Confederacy, although winning, are having some problems, and it's primarily due with the fact that, again, they have a smaller population, so they're having some trouble there. It just seemed like a matter of time before the Union was able to capture, the capital of Richmond and stuff like that. New Orleans, the big southern city, had already been captured. So such is it looking like things are going in the favor of the Union, that the Union will actually stop recruiting, thinking that the end of the war was near. Well, the reality is that's going to become pretty clear that it's not. Robert E. Lee commits himself to continuing to fight. Union and Confederate troops meet again at Bull Run, this time being second battle of Bull Run or second battle of Manassas. And this is a total Union disaster and a big Confederate victory. The reality is, with this victory, war will continue on. And once again, recruiting efforts continue. And the North are just kind of looking to turn the tide of the war because, as we've been seeing here, not very much has been going in the Union's favor. Okay, here, by the way, is a quote from McClellan, and I'll bring McClellan up, more and more. But McClellan really did not get along well with Lincoln. So the president is no more than a well-meaning baboon. I went to the White House directly after tea, where I found the original guerrilla about as intelligent as ever. What a specimen to be at our head of affairs now. Really fascinating. When he issues this quote, he is the major general of the Union troops. So this is what he's saying about his boss. You cannot have that going on and think you're going to be successful. It's just not going to work. Lincoln actually is forced to, or not forced, he removes McClellan because of his bad commanding, and appoint some other people, but then will actually have to be forced to bring McClellan back because he can't find a suitable replacement. Again, this is one of the reasons why there's going to be such a struggle early on when we talk about fighting of the war. Okay, I want to talk about the first major turning point of the war that will go in the Union's favor, which is at the Battle of Antietam. So this is the first time the Confederates decide to not play on one of their huge advantages, which was to be on the offensive, which was to be on the defensive. They're going to go on the offensive here. Again, really not necessary. Okay, they've been winning playing defense. They don't need to do this. There's a lot more risk going on the offensive. But Robert E. Lee decides to do that because he feels as though he might be able to achieve a big Confederate victory that would really crush the morale of the Union and really, be so much larger in scope in victory compared to what's been going on in the Confederacies, in the southern part. So that's what he decides he's going to do here. Well, surprisingly, or at least to some degree, the Union will win. And again, it's a big day of losses for both sides, but because the Union has so many more men, their losses do not necessarily stack up as seriously as the Confederacy. And the Confederacy do retreat. Now, Lincoln having some happiness because they've had this relatively big victory, but he is disappointed and very frustrated when he finds out that McClellan does not pursue after this relatively big win. So that's obviously a big problematic situation. And it really is an issue because you really could have capitalized on this victory even more so. But even without, this is for the first major turning point of the war. Okay, this is the first significant battle that the Union has won. And by the way, the Civil War is the bloodiest and deadliest war in U.S. history. And the Battle of Antietam is the bloodiest single day of fighting that actually has ever occurred in American history. So just kind of interesting to consider there. About 24,000 deaths by both sides. Here, by the way, is a look at casualties and then at various phases of the day. Remember, when we talk about military casualties, we include dead and seriously wounded. And again, that's a lot of the deaths that actually come about from the Civil War. It's people that get shot and then due to primitive medical practice, they decide to try to amputate, but it doesn't work, so people bleed out and other things like that. But this is a very, as the numbers show, a very, very deadly and very bloody day, the deadliest in history of the United States. And here's another look. Okay, the last thing that I want to wrap up with here is why do we even talk about something like the Battle of Antietam? Well, it leads to probably one of the most, if not the most important proclamation in United States history, known as the Emancipation Proclamation. Early on in the war, the Union passed what became known as the Confiscation Act. This allowed Union soldiers to seize all enemy territory, which technically included slaves, which meant that sometimes as a Union army approached, a slave or two would, try to run out and escape, and, if they could rank themselves within the Union army, they would have the ability to do so. That's good. That being said, though, not that many slaves actually are, come into the Union or into Union Army with the Confiscation Act. So there's kind of this idea that, there needs to be more done. More done for the slaves, yeah, somewhat, but more done to make a big stand and to make a big stance and to say some big, bold statement that would certainly weaken the Confederacy. However, in order to do that, the Union needed a solid military victory, a victory that they could come up with and they could say, and then they could issue this proclamation boldly. Versus the way things were going before Antietam, it would have looked like their backs were up against the wall. They were issuing this declaration or proclamation out of desperation. So they decide, hey, look, we need some big military victory. Antietam provides that for them. After Antietam happens, Lincoln will officially issue his Emancipation Proclamation, which will declare all slaves in the rebelling states to be free. Okay, on January 1st, 1863. Now, again, he's declaring slaves free in a part of the country that doesn't recognize that he's even the legitimate, person in charge, and doesn't actually respect his legitimacy at all. But it doesn't really matter, because what Lincoln has now effectively done with the Emancipation Proclamation is he has made the war officially about slavery. We know that that was what caused, but we know that the Republicans hadn't really taken a firm stance on it, other than saying they just didn't want it in the new territories. But now that war has gone on, they say, you know what, we're crushing this all the way together. And now they've made it clear, we as the Union are against slavery. The Confederacy, they are pro-slavery. And so now what you've done is you completely change the tide and you change the message about the war. This will result in some degree of loss of support in the Confederacy. Again, for some, now that it's about, like explicitly about slavery, there's going to be some people that say, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't really seem good. So that's, significant to look at. But the bigger thing here, and probably the most important effect, other than the fact that slavery will no longer exist after the Emancipation Proclamation, and again, there's going to have to be something more concrete in the country, but at the same time, you've effectively ended slavery now at this point, is that there is, as far as fighting is concerned, there is not going to be any foreign intervention, and there is not going to be any intervention coming in from Britain or France, okay? Because if Britain or France come in on the side of the Confederacy, that means they support slavery, which is definitely something they do not want to be associated with. So now you've closed that hole, and the Confederacy is going to be forced to fight themselves. And so again, that's hugely significant to kind of consider and think about there. Again, interesting to think about. He does not include the border states because he says the rebelling states, and we know that the border states are technically not rebelling. But the reality is that's smart for two reasons. One, why is it smart? Well, now he's not pressuring them. They wanted to largely be left alone. He's leaving them alone. He's not declaring any action in those areas. But the other thing is that with slavery now being deemed not happening in the Deep South, it definitely is not going to survive in these border states. So again, extremely significant piece of legislation or proclamation. It's not really firm legislation at this point, and something that changes this tide of the war and moves it over in the favor of the Union. This is, by the way, Lincoln with his cabinet, and again, they came up with the Emancipation Proclamation before it was actually issued, but they were holding on to it because they were looking for that big victory, and that big victory happens with Antietam. And here, by the way, is a look at this proclamation. Again, in January 1863, all persons enslaved within any state who are in rebellion against the United States, so specifically calling out the Confederate states, are forever free. So again, a significant moment here, certainly for the institution of slavery in the United States, but more so, for now at least, for fighting this war and making sure it's clear that you've made this war about slavery, and if you attempt to intervene and help the Confederacy out, you're supporting slavery, which again, Britain or France would want nothing to be a part, would not want to be anything to deal with that. Okay, well, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. You're now 2 done, only 1 more left, and by the way, the last one is the shortest, so pay attention, take notes of that, and talk soon. See you soon.